which we know so little. Um, we're doing this as part of the launch of a fascinating new report called Cuba's Parallel Worlds, which was the result of 2 years of field work and that was coordinated by one of our favorite authors, Ann Nelson, who is sitting here today. Ann is not a relative, and that's not the reason that I think so highly of her, but she's someone that has written several CIMA reports in the past, and we enjoy working with her, and we know that this work has been done in a really serious and important way. I think the report really opens up a really important conversation about what is going on in Cuba, which we know has had this history of closing down media, but is now on the verge of connecting itself to the rest of the world, maybe not in the most expected ways. So it's going to be really interesting to hear both how they did this work, how they found it out, and what it means about the future, and what it should tell us about other countries that face similar kinds of problems that Cuba, with its poor infrastructure and electricity grid that doesn't work half the time, how this can help us work in similar environments across the world. Our moderator today is Amel Rios Wong, who is a program officer for Latin American and Caribbean Department here at the NED, and he manages the Cuba and Nicaragua grants programs. I'm going to turn the mic over to him, and he's going to carry us through the day. We'll stop as soon as we have something to eat, and please don't leave at that moment. Please bring your food back in and let us carry this out. We're sorry about the confusion with this, but we'll make it through there. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mark, and welcome all, and welcome to our guest speakers for the event. As Mark mentioned, we have a great panelist assembled for you guys, and it includes Anne, who's a renowned academic on issues of media development and the intersection of human rights and media. It's also joining us Mariela Machado, who's someone with an IT expert with significant experience in the telecom industry in Venezuela, in Peru, now some in Cuba. And last but certainly not least is Hugo Landa, who's the director of CubaNet News, and a digital media for Cuban independent journalists to report about what's going on in the island, not only to the domestic audience, but also to individuals abroad interested in Cuba. So with you have their extended bios with you, so feel free to take a look at them. Before I start, let's go over briefly some of the logistics that we all hear when we attend one of these events. Please put your cell phones in silent mode or vibrate and so on. Hopefully, the only interruption we will get will be related to food, not to a phone ringing. With that said, let's turn it over to our guests. And the idea here is that we have an informal dialogue that will eventually be open to you guys as well. So as you hear them, please think of questions that you have, especially those of you that have read the report ahead of time. We will certainly be looking out for what you have to say about it. And as always, of course, keep it short. So let's start with the authors of the report. So Anne and Mariela, why don't you tell us what led you to write this report? What was the interest in the digital media space in Cuba, and how was the process of conducting the research and writing the report?
So I am the author of this report, which quotes Mariela. And the report, I guess the genesis, well, let me just say that I've been writing about the Caribbean for 40 years. And I've been working in digital media for 20. So this was a chance for the two to come together in a really exciting way for me. I first made it to Cuba in 2013, and I was looking specifically at digital media. I didn't realize how timely that visit would be because it was right before the Big Bang. So I found that digital media was very, very limited. I was able to get online at the hotel kind of for $6 an hour, and ordinary Cubans had very, very little possibility of even experiencing the internet. So I came back and I was really interested in finding out more. I went online and found that a lot of the information published online was out of date or wrong. And I went to Columbia University and the School of International and Public Affairs, where I have been teaching for quite a while, and proposed a large research project that would take a team of Spanish-speaking students to do something comprehensive, well, as comprehensive as possible, on Cuban communications infrastructure and the possibilities, the limitations, and just finding facts about it, and then combine it with some field research. And Mariela was the team leader for the research, and we have another member of the team, Laura Lemon, if you can raise your hand, and a terrific group of students who went on spring break, fanned out over the northern third of the island. And we believe that they must have surveyed over 200 Cubans about how they use cell phones, whether they get online, what the cost structures were, user behavior. 200 is not a huge sample, but we think it's bigger than most people have gotten. And so the information has been very, very specific. It was published in a massive wiki written by the students and published on Columbia's server, which you can find. It's called ICT for Cuba. I recommend it highly. They did a tremendous job. Then we published several articles for Foreign Affairs. And I wrote the report for CIMA as kind of the third iteration, which goes farther into the background, the policy implications, and I was also able to add interviews with US tech executives who've been involved in building out infrastructure in Cuba. They were off the record, obviously, but this is the first time I know of where they've told the story of how US tech corporations' involvement has unfolded.
Great, thanks. Mariela, tell us a little bit about your experience. So you were the team leader of researchers, and how was that?
Have a background in that in the private sector and infrastructure, which I will speak about in a few minutes. And it aligned also with my background in Venezuela and having a lot in common with Cuba in politics and a lot of and culture as well. So it aligned those two things and for me it was an amazing experience.
I'd also like to add that we worked with another Columbia administrator, Debbie Spindelman, who's a specialist in development practice, who brought a great deal to the project.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So now it's working. So yeah. So it aligned like both of my experiences and going back, like going to Cuba and being there for 2 weeks. It kind of you get in there, and as Annie's saying, it was quite different compared to other projects. It was like quite informal, and we had interviews with people on the ground, like in the streets, which gave us a lot of insights that we will be speaking to you a lot about, actually in their report. So yeah, that was an amazing experience, and we had a great team. Laura that is there. I need to praise them because they were awesome.
Great. So please share a little bit what were the findings of the report. What did you actually, for those of us that have not fully read the report yet and so on, what were the findings of your research?
So I'm gonna try, yeah, I'm gonna try to focus on one part, and then Anne will mention the other. So basically, we found two things. I will be speaking about two of the findings. First, the infrastructure, and then what we found about the offline culture that we have been written quite about in foreign affairs. So the main thing that I want to talk to you about is like a lot of people don't think about the infrastructure implications when you talk about freedom of expression, when you talk about the internet. You don't think about the implications that might have in terms of finance. You know, how much would that imply, and how much does that cost? So we started out desk researching back in New York about like what was out there in the infrastructure, what was the data that we had in terms of people using the internet, like what was the infrastructure in place and why it's not working, right? In so many, and what we found was that the data was quite of let's call it bias. So we found like that we found two different numbers that were quite differentiated, and of course we understood that basically it was because it came from the government and the others came from opinions or other kind of like independent sources. So we wanted to go to the ground and kind of find out and test out. We had our mobiles, we had our computers, so let's see, what is the connectivity that they have, what is the speed, and what are they doing with it. So
And, and
yeah,
sorry, just to put it in a time frame. This
yeah.
was when, more or less?
So this started during it's like through the whole spring. So it started in March, no, in January. The field trip was March, and then it ended like all the publications between June and May
Of this year.
of this year. Yeah, yeah. So it's quite recent. Yeah.
Great.
So I wanted to talk to you about the infrastructure in terms of what we found, and like just to give you a brief overview. So the infrastructure for the internet, what we call the internet and ICT and telecommunications, is internal and external. So they have to be connected in the country. That is what you're seeing there in that map. So it has to have a backbone, what we call a backbone, which are just like cables, fiber optic cables connecting each house or like each backbone, let's call it that way. And that's when you think about the internet, a lot of people don't think about this. It also implies that they need to be connected to the outside world. So this might be the external connections that they need to be in place so that I can send an email to a server that is in China. So a lot of people don't think about these infrastructure implications, and it's quite of like it's the basic of internet governance, of infrastructure, of internet in general. So putting it that way, the internal infrastructure in Cuba it's quite weak. Let's call it weak and not updated, as you all know, because they don't have like this extensive connectivity, and it's supposed to be upgraded, but they don't have any firm plans yet for that. So this is one important part of it. And then, of course, it's like what we found about the Wi-Fi spots. And the Wi-Fi spots is kind of that, I call it, I think it's hopeful. It's a like good step towards opening up, but it's like a band-aid of a problem that is larger than that. So for infrastructure to function, to be sustainable, and to increase the speed, and to give access to everyone, you cannot have Wi-Fi spots providing the internet. So, but I just mentioned it because it's a big step, and it has opened a lot of doors, and a lot of the findings that we had came from these Wi-Fi spots. So the external ones, yeah. So this, like, now I want you to like get out of here, and at least you will know that, like, maybe in an ICT engineer. So when you think about the internet, this is where like all the connections are coming from. All of these are submarine cables that are connecting the world as it is right now. So of course, if we take a deeper look into Cuba and we sum out like a little bit, we find that it's totally disconnected. And of course, we understand the reasons, and I'm not going to get into that. But we have the Venezuelan cable, of course, going to my country, that was installed in 2011. Well, it finished in 2011, and in 2013, it started getting traffic. So, in those years in between, there's a lot of, well, and in the report Anne mentions as well, there's a lot of secrets, from both governments, a lot of corruption cases, a lot of problems that has hindered, the deployment, let's say, of this solution reaching the Cubans. Of course, the Wi-Fi hotspots maybe are a consequence of this like increment of speed, although it's not reaching everyone because of what I mentioned of the internal infrastructure. So just so that you bear that in mind, and this other cable to Jamaica is just the backup of that other one. So yeah, this is the ALBA one, and this was a kind of very important, part of our research and trying to figure out if that really, what's important for the. I'm not gonna extend that much, but just like as a final thought, this graph we made just so that you understand how it's what is one of the problems of the internet and the ICTs and the telecommunications in Cuba. And it's basically that everything is controlled by the government, which is ETEXA, which is government led. And one of the problems that we see for the future, and I see personally, is that the infrastructure development, as you can see, it's cables that are going underneath the earth, and it has a lot of costs, not only to install, but to maintain and to upgrade. Every day you want to get on Facebook and when you want to see more videos. So that upgrade costs a lot of money. And this, as it is right now, it's kind of the question how they're going to deal with that amount of money. And these are some of the questions that I would love, to hear your thoughts about your questions if you have any ideas. So at Texas and the Cuban government, we really need to open up in terms of money and to private sector. And most of the countries in the world has done, like they did that in their moment. They opened up, they privatized it because the costs were so high, they needed to do so. So, this is a question for you to think about. And the other part of the research, and I'm going to be brief here because I'm speaking too much, and you should, I'm Venezuelan, so I speak a lot. And the other one was the offline sharing culture, which we found was amazing because as you see, the infrastructure is like it's not in place yet, but it seems that the people are prepared, to receive and to communicate, and they're finding new ways and innovative ways to communicate, which for me, was like my biggest. I was so impressed. I was not really expecting that at all. And it's that you have this like information that is kind of leaking, let's call it leaking, to like one person or three, and then these people are multiplying the information phone by phone, so they don't need the actual internet. They're creating their own networks without the connectivity that we know so far. So it's kind of, I like to call it social networks. And Cubans, are very, like they speak a lot, they know each other, so they share the information freely, phone to phone, through Bluetooth connection. So the best example of that was Sapia. They used this app called Sapia, where they shared their apps through Bluetooth. And it was amazing. Everywhere you go and you had your mobile in your hand, they will tell you, can you share your apps? Like, where are you coming from? Can you give me your apps? And they have apps I have never seen in my life, 60 or 70, 80 apps in like one guy that I talked to, which is kind of amazing. And then El Paquete, which, yeah, maybe, you can talk a little bit more about that. And I'm sure all of you have heard about El Paquete, and they share the media information, pen drive to pen drive and computer to computer. So,
We will expand
yeah, we will
on all of
expand
this
on
in the
that one. Yeah.
conversation.
So I will leave it to.
I want to actually turn it over to Hugo and hear from you, Hugo. What does this all mean to you and to Cubanet and to the reporters and the independent journalists that you work with in the island?
All right. I must start by telling you that my knowledge of technology is very limited. So I don't know if I'm the right guy to be here, but the perspective that I can bring to the conversation is the one of an implementer. Cubanet is a news site specializing on Cuban issues and publishing the work of and the reports of independent journalists within the island. We have been doing this for many years, probably longer than anybody else. Cubanet was founded in 1994 when even the internet was new. So we've seen it all. We've witnessed, we've suffered, we have enjoyed all the process of opening communications in Cuba and the quote unquote digitalization of Cuba. I'm going to make a little bit of history. Back in '94, when Cubanet was founded, when it started, communications in Cuba, especially from abroad and also within the island, were very, very limited. Uh, Nobody had a computer. It was actually illegal to own a computer. Nobody owned a cell phone. And when I mean nobody, of course, I'm not included the elite and the apparatski and the members of the government. I'm talking about the people, the general population. So they couldn't have phones, the cell phones. The number of landlines even was very limited because basically after 1960, a very few landlines were installed in houses in Cuba. It was I know that as a personal experience. I left Cuba in 1980, and we lost the phone we had in our home when I was a child in 1960 something because we moved to another place. And the story of my life was the story of waiting to have a phone at home. And I got my home phone in New York. I never had it in Cuba. So it was very difficult to have a phone in Cuba. Communications were very limited. Our work as a news media was very difficult. The way we received the reports from Cuba was over the landline, over the phone. They were recorded, they were transcribed, and they were published. So that's the background. So we've seen a lot of improvement through the years. A, a significant milestone for us was 2008 when Raúl Castro, that had inherited the government from his brother, decided to allow Cubans to make it legal, at least, to have a cell phone and to own a computer. Not the connection to the internet, but at least you had the computer. And that was a very significant step. And from there on, everything started to change. Now we have communications constantly with our reporters in Cuba. We receive real-time information. It's not very difficult to email them. They email their work, especially since they opened the Wi-Fi points. So we have seen progress. The point that to me is very important to make is that no matter how much we concentrate or we talk about the technological difficulties or how behind is Cuba in infrastructure, to me, the main obstacle is political uh, will to connect Cuba. And I think that that's what plays what plays the most important role in this conversation. It all depends on the decisions the Cuban government make and on what they decide that the future is going to be. From my point of view, and again, I repeat, I'm not a techie. I know very little about technology. From my point of view, the Cuban government has realized that there cannot be a modern country without internet. That they're in desperate need of money, and the only way, and they so far they haven't found anybody to give money away, willing to give them money at this point after the Venezuelan cow got exhausted, and and that's what it is. They are trying, in my opinion, from what I see, and you don't see a continuous, not even a slow movement towards openness and granting internet access to you. And what you see is an erratic course that they open one day, they close the following day, and that's what we have seen. And I can tell from our own experience, our site was censored, inaccessible from Cuba through history until one good day last year in around August, we realized when we constantly monitored our traffic through Google Analytics, we realized that we were getting traffic from Cuba, and the traffic increased and increased, and we sent out people to the Wi-Fi points in Cuba to see if the site was accessible there, And indeed it was. We used to get traffic from the weirdest place in the planet, the North Pole and whatever, and we knew that those were the Cubans accessing the site through proxies, but we started to get direct traffic. And suddenly, a couple of weeks ago, no traffic from Cuba. They closed our site. So that illustrates that it's not a matter of only a matter of connectivity or a matter of technological resources. It's a matter of political will. And within this change, may be linked to the return of Abel Prieto to the Ministry of Culture after the brief stay there of someone else. I don't even remember the number of the minister. And I think that we link the closing of Cubanet to that, to a closing on the access to information. That's the way I see it.
What do you think of that, Anne? You mentioned that your report touches on policy implications. I mean, Hugo is basically saying that a lot here depends on political will from the Cuban regime. How do you see this?
Yeah, and I don't see it as an either or assumption because I think that there are three factors we need to pay attention to. One is the political sector, and there are many excellent anti-censorship groups that have done huge amounts of research on that side. So in the report, I say, go look to CPJ, go look to Article 19 in Freedom House if you want to know about government censorship. This report is about some other things. So the second sector is the economic factor, which I think is hugely important and more important over the past year than ever. If I were going to point to one thing that I think is transformative in Cuba, it would be the introduction of PayPal a few months ago. Because when you have a country that's totally cut off from any form of e-commerce, that's one of their hopes in the sky is tourism, they're hamstrung without any access to online payment platforms. So you bring in PayPal, and that opens up lots of other doors. It's not a coincidence that Airbnb is one of the early entrants. Then you've got U.S. cell phone companies coming in, Verizon. Then so you have this ripple effect. And I don't think for a moment that the Comandante said we want more freedom of expression. I think they said we need revenues, and this is the only way to move ahead. And, I'd like to put in a word for the ordinary Cubans. There's so many people who live on a state salary of $20 a month, okay? Now, granted, their rent is taking care of medical education. That's great. And that there's subsidized food. But still, when you tell those people that going online with your Nauta card from the state telecom is $2 an hour, and your income for your family is $20 a month, that's a huge chunk. And so, somebody told me, yeah, I buy a T-shirt for my kid, it's $8. Pair of shoes, I pay $40 for tennis shoes. So the level of want, even among professionals like doctors, is extreme. And so what I heard, and I think the students heard, was a lot of real bread and butter communications issues. I think a lot of people would like to have access to the internet, but what they really need at the moment is affordable cell phones, so they can call their kids. And that's where a lot of the economic issues come in, because right now the cost of the infrastructure, the cost of a cell phone on those salaries is prohibitive. And that's where you get to what we call in my report the suitcase economy, because those people who have relatives living outside the country who'll give them their discarded cell phones, that's gold. And a lot of the cell phones you see people using are not smartphones, not even feature phones. They're 10-year-old, dumb phones held together with Scotch tape. So I think that, as we talk about government censorship, that's important. The economic impetus that's going on at the highest levels is extremely important. It hasn't really trickled down to make a difference in ordinary people's lives quite yet. But I don't want us to lose sight of this whole social factor. And that also comes to another point that's extremely important. Cubans are really smart.
Thank you.
And when you give them next to zero resources, and you have these young developers and hackers, they create the kind of ingenious workarounds that Mariela was talking about. And we saw this as an opportunity. They have figured out, how to do things with no data plan, no broadband, a very quirky electrical grid, and do very interesting things in terms of offline apps and all kinds of content. Now, what I'm thinking, as somebody who's done research on sub-Saharan Africa, where you also have no broadband, where you have no 4G, where you have really problematic electrical grids, what if we could take our ideas about ICT for D that we've been talking about and contact these incredibly clever young Cuban developers and say, how could we, approach these markets in a whole new and creative way?
Something that you mentioned, Mariela, in that your research mostly focused on the western part of the island, which includes Havana and sort of its 2 or 3 neighboring provinces. So a lot of what you describe very enthusiastically and exciting is only reflected on a third, at best, uh, part of the island. Do you have a sense of what is the landscape in the rest of the country, in the central and eastern provinces of Cuba? Is there such dynamism going on, this host of apps and sharing that you speak of, el paquete and those phenomena? How do they manifest in the rest of the country outside the capital?
Yeah. So the sense that we got, like we basically researched just a couple of cities and towns and small towns. We didn't get a chance to go to Santiago, for example, but we got a sense that was something that was like multiply in Cuba overall. Since we met a lot of people in Havana, that also came from these parts of the countries, and we also like interviewed these people and kind of understood that it's something that is now a Cuban thing, I like to call it. This like offline culture is something that has been multiplied in ways that they're unimaginable because like Annie's saying, I was there in 2012 first, and this didn't exist at all. And it kind of multiplied in this wave, and we were talking about this before the session, this gray area that Cuba is now in, and these policies that are going everywhere, like you were mentioning, and they have opened up. Like now, there's this space where it's kind of open, but it's not. And these Wi-Fi hotspots, they are actually open. You can access Facebook, and you can access services that before you couldn't. So all this information is kind of leaking into the country, and I really want to believe that even in the small towns, you get el paquete, you get something. Of course, not in the poorest part of the country, because you need a computer, you need a phone, and for that, there's the informal economy that comes in. You cannot buy it with your salary, but the people that live abroad can send it to you, or you can buy it for the tourist at low price. So it's, yeah, but I got a sense that this was something that was really,
Right.
all over Cuba, and that is multiplying in unimaginable ways.
And I think it's important just to put this into perspective that while some of these tools and channels of distribution of information are increasing, there are still great, very significant barriers to access that just involve the economy, having the equipment to use it, and that the majority of the population still cannot afford them and does not enjoy them. Just so we're all on the same page, why don't you explain to us what is the paquete? What is the paquete? What are these very unique tools and phenomena that have developed that are definitely exclusive to Cuba in the Americas? El paquete, rebolico, all of these that you mentioned in your report.
Funny you should ask. So again, my preconception of Cuba was, and certainly what I saw in 2013 was total censorship. There's nothing recognizable as journalism in terms of print I'm sorry, but that's not what I think Granma is. I don't call Granma journalism. So fast forward to 2016, El Paquete is this kind of mystery product. It is content downloaded probably in the United States initially in vast quantities, copied onto flash drives, USB sticks. And it has several levels of content distribution. They go into small shops for local distribution. People bring their own flash drives, and for the going rate of $2 a week, they get this content loaded onto their own flash drive and then circulate it to pretty much everyone they know. They seem to have a lot of relatives. So what's on El Paquete? Well, you can think of it as the equivalent of a local newsstand that will change depending on the community it's serving. The University of Havana students we talked to had a fairly high-minded media diet. People were reading the New York Times, The Economist, watching the BBC, as well as expressing shock that we hadn't seen the last season of Game of Thrones. It's like, you Americans are so out of it.
And that all came from El Paquete.
It all came from El Paquete. So the urban educated youth had a diet that would look pretty similar to what our students at Columbia would have on a good day. Now, in the rural areas, it's going to be more likely to be telenovelas and Super Sábado and entertainment shows, including some new shows, but mostly Spanish language content. A lot of stuff from South America as well as Miami. But what we're talking about is just quantities of content that was hard for me to wrap my brain around. Because El Paquete may have all of the seasons of House of Cards, which is another big favorite down there, by the way. So I think that we were kind of stunned that the Cubans that we were talking to were so worldly in terms of this international content that they were really conversant with, very up to date. And we kept saying, well, isn't it a problem for you to read the Miami Herald? And what seems to be the case is that the government really cares about what diaspora Cubans say against the government. So the people who run El Paquete, which is a commercial enterprise, know what line to tread, right? The New York Times reporting on Syria is not a problem, but a Cuban dissident in Miami is, so they just don't put it on in most cases.
Right.
There's no standard statement you can ever make about Cuba because there are always going to be exceptions. But what we saw based on vast amounts of evidence is that El Paquete reaches every little neighborhood. You don't have to have a computer, by the way. A lot of people are buying big screen TVs with a USB port in it.
Or a DVD player would do it.
So this reaches a very popular audience, and I cannot stress enough what a game changer it is.
Hugo, does CubaNet use El Paquete in a way, or they didn't say that?
Yeah. I agree with Dan. I think from our anecdotal experience, me as a Cuban who lives in Miami, that has family in Cuba and knows a lot of Cubans, I think that the reach of El Paquete is nationwide. Even I have friends who have relatives in the smallest towns in the middle of nowhere, and they talk through IMO. They go to a Wi-Fi point regularly, and of course, all the money for that comes from Miami. But that's what makes it possible, because they have to pay $2 an hour to connect to the Wi-Fi. But yes, I think that the reach is nationwide. It's nationwide, and also. Anecdotes that I've heard. Some people buy a spaghetti and maybe 2 or 3 people get together and purchase a spaghetti and they share it. And they get together to watch the shows, or they lend it to the neighbor next door. So it's a total game changer from a Cuba that was totally disinformed and disconnected from the world to the level of information that that the people is getting now.
Please.
So yeah, I just wanted to add, like, regarding my first comments, how like these networks, offline networks, are being built, and El Paquete is like a big part of that. I would call it kind of like the offline internet. How they're sharing this information and media, which is like mostly why we connect to the internet to search information media. And I think like the really interesting part for me was that they're even now, they have a page called Revolico that you mentioned, which is kind of a Craigslist, but offline. So they put the ads and they put their phone numbers and you can call. So they have created even, kind of like an eBay, of offline,
Right.
which for me, it's, yeah, part of what Anne was saying. It's kind of amazing, the Cuban innovation, like to that level and to that kind of level of distribution. So they're distributing the content like in such a way that it's unseen in the world.
And if somebody does not have Reolico, they can use Zapier to pass the app from one phone to the other.
Exactly. So you can mix the mobile networks, like offline, what I call, phone to phone, and then mix it with El Paquete, which is what I call like the fixed network, kind of like the internet that you get at home. So yeah, an offline, culture, an offline internet.
Yes.
That all of this takes place with utter disregard for international intellectual property law. And it's not limited to the offline internet. When we were there, state television broadcast The Danish Girl on primetime. I don't know the legal specifics of what they did, but I'm guessing. Now, this brings us to something else, which goes back to the pricing structure, because again, you have, we don't know, maybe a dozen people, maybe more, getting the benefit of this content obtained under questionable legal circumstances for $2 a week shared out. So it's really pennies. And this is content that all of us are paying, well, in my case, Time Warner plus Netflix plus whatever. So we're talking about a benefit for pennies that cost, us in some cases, over $100 a month. So if Cuba ever did join the international community in terms of its media business, the price structure could actually serve to take information away from the Cuban public.
So it'll definitely impact the way advertising is done in the future, the way commercial relations related to the media basically will be shaped in the island.
Advertising and a commercial media from the ground up. Now, you could say that they get to skip over all the mistakes we've made over the last 20 years, but it's going to be the Wild West.
Right.
Okay, yeah, it's on. Okay, they have to, and they are already doing it, because we know for a fact that there are advertising agencies, independent advertising agencies in Cuba, that they make promotional videos that they are included in the paquete. They make PDF magazines that are included in the paquete, and that's something that just sprouted in the last few months.
How does the government react to all of this? How does the government, does it tolerate? Does it? What's happening here? I mean, this sounds in a way
I
too
think
good to be true.
there is a fine line. My theory, that, as I was telling you, is that corruption reaches all levels, and there is people in the government at different levels that are also making money out of the paquete by turning their eyes to the other side. That's, I don't have a way to prove it, but I think that is also happening. Everybody is getting something from a paquete. The government so far is as Anne says in the report, is tolerating it. It's neither legal nor illegal. It's illegal. No one talks about that. But obviously, if the government wanted to stop it, really, they would. They have all the repressive apparatus to do it, and they could do it like they do in North Korea or something. That if you're caught with a pen drive with El Paquete, you'll go to jail for 30 years or whatever they decide. So obviously, it's been tolerated so far.
Yeah, and just to add to that, it's kind of that gray area that I mentioned earlier that I think Cuba is in right now, and it's kind of a great opportunity. I see it as a great opportunity because it's kind of like a door that opened and we don't know where it's closing, right? But that access to information, like those people getting used to the information, that's something that you cannot take away from them. So, I see it as a very interesting opportunity, and what I felt with El Paquete managers, like with those people that we reach out to, like we want El Paquete, was that they it's not that it's open. Everyone knows about it, which I think is really Cuban, but there's not like official. So they were like I got in contact with them because a person that he trusted recommended me. So it's kind of like this network of trust, outside the government. But of course, the government knows. So, that's maybe a good explanation what he.
Yes, I know that in the report you kept referring to the gray area, to the black market in which essentially this all operates. And in part of the report, I mean, thinking of your mention of the black market, I thought that there were some parts that perhaps to a foreign audience or to an American audience could be a bit misleading in what they meant. And I remember you referring to the black market as la lucha.
Well, la lucha is the gray market.
Right.
The black market is something else.
Yes. La lucha, but la lucha as a physical place does not exist. La lucha is the expression that Cubans use to get by every day. It means the struggle in Spanish, and that is the way Cubans have been living for five, almost 6 decades. So when people interact on the street and salute each other and greet each other, say, "How are you doing?" "I'm struggling, luchando. Estoy en la lucha." So someone who may not be familiar with that may think that la lucha is actually a market, a place where people meet and so on. So I just wanted to clarify that a little bit because in case somebody may think that there's like this big open air market where people actually, get there and distribute flash drives and things.
La lucha is a state of mind.
La lucha is indeed a state of mind, like pura vida for Costa Ricans is la lucha for la lucha for Cubans, most certainly. And I wanted you I wanted to ask you before I open it up to the floor. What does it all mean? What does this all mean in terms of policy implications for the United States government as it continues to engage the Cuban regime, for the Cuban government as it has to deal with increasing demand internally for these services and so on? Where do you see this going?
I could be accused of being a little idealistic, I suppose. And I just came from giving a presentation in Miami, and I was thinking, oh boy, this is just like the challenge for a marriage counselor, right? Because you've got people who are very close to each other but very far away with very hot issues in the middle. And yet, idealistically speaking, there's the Cuban people. And they have some things that they really need, and there's been some real hardship there. And I would love to see this moment in history be one where people could focus on that and say, well, what benefits them? My opinion is that more information benefits them, and they're getting it. Mm-hmm. And that makes me really glad. And I think there are ways to build on it. And I think that there are ways to build on it without compromising one's principles with the government. I felt that I heard over and over again that Cubans are afraid of a violent transition. Nobody wants that.
Right.
So here we have this huge opportunity presented by a confluence of factors. The government is economically desperate. The Obama administration made some initiatives. Big technology companies like Google showed some interest and took some new steps. The Cubans, who are incredibly smart, have figured out ways to work around and join the technological revolution in their own terms. If you put all of that together, you have a new conversation. And if you keep focusing on what benefits real people and children and sick people and so on, you could have some really interesting experiences. One thing that I say in the report is that the U.S. Department of Agriculture is already working in Cuba with the Ministerio de Agricultura, looking at agriculture projects to benefit things like clean water and organic farming. That sounds like progress to me. And the opportunities for ICT for D and technology for food security and safe practices is phenomenal. So I think looking for these side doors that go around the contentious political debate as it continues, and having more of the people-to-people technology exchange could be a really wonderful thing for the future. We do have a member of our team here, Laura Lehman, and would it be all right if she just added her 2 cents?
Sure.
Okay, yeah. Or you can use mine.
I'll stand over here. Hi. Well, you've heard a lot about the overarching theme of our research, obviously, which was ICT for D, but we also broke the research into 3 different sectors. As Anne started talking about agriculture, we also looked at health and at arts and culture. So my team was looking at the arts and culture sector. So we were mostly in Havana talking to artists, dancers, promotional people who work at the Bellas Artes, at the Fábrica del Arte, at the ballet. And I think the overarching impression that I got more than anything was how open everyone was to talking to us. No one was afraid to talk to us. No one was secretive. They were very excited that we wanted to talk to them, and they wanted their perspective to be heard. And everything that you heard about kind of the offline internet and apps and the paquete applies in these different sectors in different ways. So artists, for example, who are using technology for promotion and for creation of arts, they also have a website offline of their work so that they can show it to people when they know they're not going to have the internet. So there's like these overarching themes are running through all of the different sectors that we looked at. And I think, Cuban people are ready, and it's a pretty exciting time. I don't know if you want to add anything about health, but.
So, and thanks, Anne, for your hopeful comments. And with having the benefit of the Cuban people in mind, let me please open it to all of you for questions. So when you get the mic, please say your name clearly, introduce yourself, and keep it short and concise so we can make the best use of the time. Anyone wants to start? You all have things to say. Ted.
Did you get into the Polydars and the private B&B sector to see how internet technologies are being used in order for them to have a good business model, and how that could also be used as a door to other activities around organizing and sharing offline and online activities?
I got into them quite literally. The first time I went, I was on an official tour, but I built in a few days in Casas Particulares in 2013. And those, and again, I had to go into a hotel lobby, have somebody call his cousin, who would tell the person who didn't have a phone next door to, it was like finding them that way. And now in 2016, our entire trip was booked online from the US on Airbnb. Now, again, this was in March of this year, and the payment systems were very ragged. We were able to pay Airbnb in the US, but on the Cuban side, they literally have managers of properties and did the transference of revenues through a guy on a motorcycle, right, door to door. And again, PayPal will transform that. Credit cards will transform that. One cautionary note, I managed to interview my Airbnb property owner. Well, maybe she didn't know it was an interview. It was a long conversation. And she told me that her family has connections to the Communist Party. You have to have permission from the government to participate in casas particulares, and the casas particulares, the private homes that rent out to tourists, are the foundation for the population who are allowed to participate in Airbnb. You have to get government permission, there are government revenues and so on that come out of the profit. So I would call it not a state enterprise, but a quasi-state enterprise. It seemed to be functioning well, but it exists in a gray zone economically. You look puzzled by that. No, I didn't say state-owned. No, well, a quasi-state, because again, if you have certain connections, you'll get approval a lot faster than if you have other connections. So I'm not saying it's state, but I think it's shaded. And I don't think it's a coincidence that families who have certain political connections are building small, little mini empires right now on this tourism model. And that's just what I found anecdotally in the trip.
I can add to that. So yeah, I mean, like what we saw was like what we're seeing in Cuba, and what I think I'm perceiving is that actually the economic, that economic liberty, let's call it liberty. I'm not sure if it's completely that way, as Anne was mentioning, but it's opening a new door of needs. And that we're seeing, but we didn't see in our past trip that was like that they're actually connected yet. There's a lot of, like, we talked first about the infrastructure, and the infrastructure is very weak, it's not upgraded, so they're not like well connected. Then we mentioned the offline culture, which is not enough for a business, to connect to Miami, to New York, because they don't actually have the physical connectivity. So I think it's opening a new need, and people are actually receiving information in new ways, and that is opening a new door that, mentioning like a little about the future. I think that's hopeful in the way that it can come from the bottom up. You can see that people are in need of information, they're getting used to information, and actually, that might open a new door for Cuba that for me it's hopeful. I'm not putting the hope in the government, unfortunately, because I come from a country that has also political, problems and regimes, that are hard to change. But I think, that's a hope for me, for Cuba and for Venezuela, that can come from the bottom up. And I think ICT might play a big role in it, hopefully.
You see a potential for what Ted is sort of referring to, yet not there yet.
Exactly. I see the potential, but it's not there yet. Yeah.
And I don't think, in the report I talk about the sectoral approach, and it's a whole different mindset towards digital media than you have in consumer societies. It's not consumer driven, it's ministry driven. So it's very vertical. And I'm not saying that's good or bad, I'm just saying it's a different approach. So rather than saying how many homes can we wire, they're saying Wi-Fi hotspots, Nauta cards sold by the state agency, and everything has its vertical organogram. And so that just means it builds out. Whereas what I see going on in the tourism sector, both in Airbnb and the very interesting work that Eusebio Leal is doing in Habana Vieja with Habana Guanex. Was doing, has been, whatever. But I don't see much connection there to digital media at all. It's like they're like these two, they're siloed from what I could see.
Any other questions? I know Luis had his hand up, and then we'll go to the gentleman and then to you, sir.
Luis from the International Center for Journalists. About the information that comes from Cuba itself. We talk about the importance of paquetes and the offline communication networks, and a lot of the paquetes are bringing a lot of good information and telenovelas and so on from overseas. But what about the information that is actually produced by the? I mean, I know there are many now community news organizations, very small kind of brochures that are being distributed in the island. How is that done, and if the paquetes are also included in these communications of local news mainly, or if they are using other means?
Thank you. Thank you. So these are like kind of big ticket item questions. So I'll just go one by one for the sake of.
Regarding el paquete, the same makers, the producers of el paquete, from my information is that they always try to steer away from anything that's political and that can be perceived as
Subversive.
decent in or subversive in any way. It's pure entertainment that has informational value, but they try to concentrate on the entertainment side. Eh, that's the way it is so far. I think that the government doesn't have to work too hard on that because it's a business after all, and they want to preserve their business. So it's a typical case of self censorship. What we are seeing here. That's my information.
I think, and from what I saw, this is not my area of expertise. And actually, Laura, Laura, you can add, a little of the arts, because I think there's content being generated in Cuba like never before. You get access to a computer, and even if you're not connected, you can write, you can take pictures, and that you can upload. So I saw like the creation of new magazines that are being passed out by the form of PDF, which I think is, like local content that can be exported when the doors open up to that connection that we're talking about. The island now is kind of isolated in a way, but it's leaking. It's getting like they're coming on Facebook. These magazines have a Facebook page, which like I follow most of them. But of course, I had to go there, to get to know them. So I think it's really, creating content in new ways, like the ICT wave, let's call it like that. Even if it's offline, I think is beginning to create new forms of thought too, and blogs. They're multiplying. They just go to the park and connect to the Wi-Fi spots, and they upload their articles. So I think there is a wave of content that is being generated locally.
Yeah, I think I agree with Mariela that the blogs are incredibly important. And again, you don't have the formation of journalism that you have in other countries. They're inventing their own thing. And I don't see El Paquete as being a hyper local product. I see it as a way to import international content more than anything else. So the other thing I would say is that it's almost frightening to speak a sentence about El Paquete or Cuba, because in 5 minutes it's going to be different. It is changing so fast. And with El Paquete, you also have thousands of versions that are curated for their local audiences. So nobody can generalize, about everything that's on it, probably even the producers themselves.
Right. I was reading a couple of days ago of the emergence of the first independent sort of media, digital media TV channels that are now being included in El Paquete, including religious TV channels. There's this one called La Luz. I think Cuban did a report on this, a multimedia report. And so in part, the answer to the like Cuban-made content being included in the paquete, it is actually starting. It will be very exciting to see how it shapes up. Uh,
Let me just add something to that. Actually, yesterday I was having a conversation that came to my mind now with someone who just came from Cuba, who lives in Cuba. At that meeting where we were, and the paquete came up in the conversation, and I just asked, "Is there porn in the paquete?" And she said there is a porn paquete also.
Right.
There is a triple X
Right.
paquete. And she, yeah, everything is in the paquete. This person was telling me that because you select what you want from the paquete when
Yeah.
you take your drive. And for some reason, she didn't select porn, but they included it, and she was surprised when she saw it. So there is even porn in the paquete.
because because in addition to being a business entity in and of itself, El Paquete is actually a phenomenon. So many constituencies create their own paquetes. If an independent digital media outlet in Cuba wants to create its own paquete, it just mirrors kind of this methodology and creates its own paquete and starts its own distribution network of sorts. It's actually fascinating in that way. Sir, I'll take your question, and let's take three at a time, actually, for the sake of time.
My name is Scott Michael. I work with the Broadcasting Board of Governors. I wanted just to get any comments you had that information you gleaned from your research about all of these new developments with ICT and an older generation of technology, satellite TV, which for a while was a big thing in Cuba, also monetized. A lot of local people would do their own, talking about the brilliance of Cuba, resolviendo. Where they'd wire their apartment block or their street, following the same kind of rules about a lot of entertainment, things like that, avoiding anything too controversial, often tolerated at least at the local level, and a moneymaker. Did you get any evidence of the role of that now in terms of providing content in addition to the sort of the suitcase approach? Is that kind of swamp for various reasons? If so, any need for or the demand for kind of more direct, quick access through satellite connections, which are, of course, illegal.
Thanks. Sir?
Thanks. My name is Jonathan Levy. I work for the Federal Communications Commission. My question's sort of partly been asked by the others, but let me just make it even more pointed, which is, do you see any role whatsoever, any positive role whatsoever for the traditional media? There was a comment by Anne regarding the newspaper sector, but what about radio and television, terrestrial radio and television? Is there any sort of hope there? Because whatever their faults, those are pretty inexpensive distribution technologies. Thank you.
Thanks. And then let's go over to Miriam. Okay. Great. Then we can take a third, if anybody. Right. Okay. You have another question from.
Hi. My name is Melissa Cabrera. I'm from the Office of the Special Rapporteur for Freedom of Expression. You were mentioning how everyone practically knew about El Paquete and these other tools to exchange information, and mainly that nothing happened. But is there any case you remember that someone told you where there might be like represalias, like actions against these persons from the government? Any, if they're small or many, or maybe any manifestation of discontent by the government? Yeah, from using it, exchanging it, producing information, but at a small scale.
Okay. So just to recap, we have a question about La Antena, which was a phenomenon very popular in the 90s as El Paquete is now, and the use of satellite TV and signal and so on. And then a question of the role of radio, TV, and more traditional media. What's the assessment on that? And then finally, have there been any reprisals for users of El Paquete, for the producers of El Paquete itself that you know of?
So I just want to say that we tried to be as systematic as we could in our survey of digital media, but that did not involve an equally systematic look at former media. So just in terms of our study, that's not what we were looking at. You see satellite dishes all over the place. Cubans watch TV. I mean, that was apparent. They watch broadcast TV. They watch state TV. They watch Telesur, which is one of the few channels they get. I was, from the best information I could find, something like 1 in 5 Cubans listens to Radio or TV Martí at least once a week. So that still has a significant influence on the island. I don't think there's anything resembling Nielsen ratings in Cuba. If there is, I couldn't find it. So in terms of audience behavior, it's going to be all anecdotal. And I also think that you're going to find, as you do here, a huge generational divide. Old people watch TV and young people are on screens. That's pretty much what we saw, and I don't have the numbers to back it up. In terms of retaliation against people for El Paquete, in everything I read and everything I heard, I did not hear of a case of that, but I did see frequent references, if not to self-censorship, then to the Paquete managers having a very clear sense of where the line was drawn and just making an absolute managerial decision not to cross it. And so I guess for me, the surprise is that, I mean, I used to hear that, Miami Herald was considered the enemy, this and that, El Nuevo Herald, and people were reading that. People were reading columnists and so on that I couldn't imagine them having access to 10 or 20 years ago. So that's what I found.
Yeah, regarding the satellite TV, I think, yeah, that was a phenomenon that was all over the region. At least in Venezuela, we had the same thing. So it's kind of, but it faded away because they blocked the signal from like a satellite point of view and a transponder. It's like a, let's say, technical explanation. And I think in Cuba it happened the same thing. And I spoke to a couple of them, and they were like, I had direct TV in my house, and now I don't, But yeah, they rely on that information like in the past, but I saw that fading away. I'm not sure, because we didn't focus on that at all, but I heard a couple of comments regarding direct TV and satellite TV. In regards like to the distribution, I agree with Anne. I think which I think it's surprising that it kind of reflects the rest of the world in a weird way, because they're isolated, at least in the information aspect, or not anymore, but it really reflects the rest of the tendencies in the world. So the younger people were not watching TV anymore. They weren't interested at all. The older people were watching Telesur, and were watching like the national TV channels. Yeah, and they got like, Telesur for them was like great, and right. Got like a lot of interest when that opened up from Venezuela. I'm not proud of that, but it's that way. And yeah, I saw like this tendency is the same. Like you see the younger people, and I spoke to a lot of students in Havana, Universidad in Havana, and it was amazing how they told you like, yeah, I saw a video of YouTube of Obama before he came, and when he said that he was coming to Cuba, I saw it like one day after, and I was so impressed because I haven't even watched that. So they're getting the information, the same that the younger people here, you see like these trips. And it's what I'm saying about Cuba. You see that desire, and they're like reflecting the rest of the world, but without the connectivity, which is like, for me, it's very surprising. So yeah. And in regards of the retaliation, I think it is in English, or one of the Paquete managers told me that, yeah, he had been like a police, or I don't know what to call him, spy, I don't know like what to call, national security. He had approached him and like made a warning. El compañero que me atiende.
El compañero. El
I love
compañero
these
que me atiende.
Cuban words. I love it.
El
And when I
compañero
go
que me
back, I will
atiende.
use it.
Very polite, distant way.
So el compañero que le atiende went to his house and like warned him that he knew that he was distributing this. I don't know what he said exactly, but he told me after that I had to be so much more careful. So this is where the line, like where we're saying it's not legal, what is it, right? But people, in Cuba, and this is what I feel, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of people are careful, they're afraid. They know now how to deal with this government that is repressive. So in that sense, he didn't like really stop doing that. He just took new measures to kind of limit his clients. So he only met people that were recommended by a friend or by a person that he knows. So this is how we got to him, and yeah, we asked him about this, of course, and that was his answer. So I'm assuming there's a lot of more cases of that, because it's not legal, not illegal. What is it, right?
Yet they're still finding ways to do it, and they're still finding ways to challenge the status quo and the state of things. So it seems, right?
Like in a very Cuban way, a la cubana.
A lo cubano. And
I just want to say that I found state TV to be weird. I oblige myself to watch television in whatever country I'm in, and you will have Chinese documentaries about giant lizards, followed by Moscow high fashion shows, followed by a guy giving this really long speech, followed by a salsa y son, and it's like, I couldn't make sense of what their programming thinking was.
It's improved a lot.
Okay.
You have no idea.
Okay. But, going back to Luis's question, when you have a society that has been living without journalism as we know it for all of these decades, it is going to come up with something unexpected down the line.
I wanted you to touch upon about a phenomenon you mentioned in the report, the phenomenon of leapfrogging. How it seems you say that it appears that Cubans are leapfrogging to mobile to get their news information or the information period, and bypassing the other platforms, sort of tying it to your question about the role of traditional media and so on and so forth. If you could elaborate more on this leapfrogging that you spoke, and what do you think? And I'd love to get your opinion on this, Hugo. What do you think of sort of the cascading effect that this leapfrogging may have in other sectors in Cuban society?
Yeah, well, first of all, I have to say that in 1959, Cuba had a really vibrant media culture, magazines, newspapers, radio, etc. And then TV. And then you go through this long, dark period where the rest of the world was developing in certain ways, and we almost had an arc in media development where you had an apex and now a decline in terms of the health of our news organizations. So they just skipped that era, like 50, 60 years. They just skipped over it. And I'm not sure you can understand what a news-free environment looks like. Where if there's a car accident on the next block and 3 people are killed, there's no reporting on it, right? If somebody's stabbed on the Malecón in a drunken fight, there's no police reporting. And we're not just talking about, affairs of state. So this, for me, presents a huge challenge. Because if they've gone without all of these kinds of garden variety reporting that we're accustomed to, and then all of a sudden you go directly to not just mobile, but social media, where you have a neighbor saying, oh, there was an accident and 3 people were killed. Well, then you get into all of our issues around citizen journalism. Is it somebody with a case to make? Is it somebody spreading false information? And I have to say that the rumor market in Cuba is the liveliest market in the economy. Yeah. So
it's called Radio Bemba.
So yeah, you leapfrog to a lot more information, and basically almost none of it curated. And I will be very curious to see how that plays out. But yeah, you
Thanks.
I'm very glad you touched on the fact that Cuba had a very vibrant culture, had a forefront of.
I don't think we can hear you.
Now? Yeah. I was saying that I was very happy that you mentioned that in 1959, before the revolution, Cuba was pretty advanced in telecommunications and in radio and in journalism at all. Because as I'm tired of talking about Cuba as if it was Somalia or some African country that was saved by the revolution. That is definitely not the case. It wasn't a perfect country. It wasn't, definitely, but it wasn't an African country. It's a totally different situation. And I totally agree with Dan. It's going to be very interesting because it's like Cuba went to sleep 50 years ago and wakes up now in the digital world. We are jumping from we missed the boat on the internet. We miss the transformation of journalism. And it's going to be a very interesting phenomenon to see how Cubans approach that and what Cubans are going to do. From my point of view, from Cubanet's experience, when we were opened in Cuba, we noticed that whenever we had a news on an accident, a murder, something like that, the traffic exploded because it's only human. It's maybe I don't know, but it's human. When you see news that someone killed someone,
Right.
you click on it, and Cubans do the same. So they are eager to know what's going on in their country beyond the accomplishment of all the goals and the success in the sugar harvest and all that. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the media and journalism evolves in Cuba now.
Yeah. And certainly the vibrant media media sphere in the 1950s played a crucial role in the downfall of the dictatorship of Fulgencio Batista. It was one of the main actors in shaping public opinion and bringing to light all the crimes that were done by that dictatorship. That was certainly clear. We have a question from the back of the room.
So I'd like to ask a question that follows on this idea of the future of the media environment in Cuba and maybe test some assumptions, because the assumption about the internet has been as it grows, as it becomes more ubiquitous, more available in societies, that news and information of consequence will grow with it. And I think one of the things that's been touched on in the Cuban context, which is very similar to other politically authoritarian settings, is that you see plenty of entertainment, you see plenty of bread and circuses, but you don't necessarily see the things that matter. And so today, just for example, if you look at the Gulf states where internet penetration is at 70, 80, 90%, you look at China where internet penetration is at 50, 60% and growing, these regimes have been remarkably adept at circumscribing serious, plural discussion of issues to a degree that I think most people didn't predict. So I wonder, what would make Cuba different, given the tenacity of the current rulers minimizing political pluralism and trying to retain a political monopoly?
Thanks. Does anybody else have any other question? Thanks. Let's then wrap with this one.
Well, again, I have to respond to that anecdotally. I found in my conversations with young Cubans a very high degree of civil and civic awareness. And if you look at some of the young bloggers, they have a real reformist tendencies. They are voluntarily writing about serious issues. And we don't even have a name for them, I don't think, because they're not necessarily, they're not party members, but they don't want to overthrow the government either. They're the loyal opposition. And one of them, who is truly brilliant, you know, we were sitting with Havana Club and for a few hours, and he said, well, we have a huge problem of corruption in Cuba. It's just terrible. And I said, yeah, well, it's pretty bad in Nicaragua. And he's like, oh, you can't imagine. We have party leaders that go to Varadero and they get a whole weekend in the hotel for their families for free. I was like, wait a minute. You know, I've seen worse. But you know, he was really indignant about that. And there are a lot of young Cubans who really want to see their country improve and hold the leadership to task. I'm not saying they're the majority, but if the world finds a way to identify the young people who have a vision of the future and you know, to help them along, I think I would be somewhat optimistic on this count, and probably more than in other neighboring societies in the Caribbean, where there's less of a civic vision and less of a sense of the state's responsibility to the people.
I have no good answer to your question. I think it's an excellent question. Like that, we didn't touch upon that in our research, but I just wanted to add my thoughts about it. I think what makes Cuba different in many ways is kind of how reserved and how jealous. They say jealous, like celosos. They are of their like of maintaining their government and the power, you know, in the Cubans. Like I feel that's very a Cuban thing, and I think that's why they haven't opened up and haven't said China, you know, come in and help us build, you know, the same that you have, and so that we have the same. Now there, and this is when what I say when I say it's a gray area. It's a gray area where they're not sure what to do, you know, and it's in this area where all of this is happening and like where el paquete is being distributed all over the place. So I understand your point that is pretty much like Brad, you know, it's like kind of just information to amuse people, and but in that you also have embedded information that is quite useful and is waking up the people in a way that I don't know if it has happened before, but I feel it's kind of different from the other context just because it's Cuba. Like I feel, you know, Cuba is a very special place, and how they're dealing with, how they have dealt, and how they're doing it now and for the future. I think that might be the difference between they becoming what the other like regimes have become. But they're in this gray area, and I have no good answer for you. And my hope is that they don't, but they might, you know, in a few months, in a year, when they see that the information is getting out there and they cannot control it anymore, which like really I think they can't because it's out there already. So, which I think is quite different from other regimes. So those are my thoughts.
Anything to add, Hugo?
Yeah, I don't have an answer for that either. No one does, I think. I think that there is thinkers in any society, in my opinion, are a majority. There is a group of people who will get the different message from all this information, and they are always going to be a minority, and they will perhaps shape the future. I also think that it is important to, and I notice it in my daily life because I live in Miami. It's important to know that the frontiers, the borders between Miami and Cuba are sort of becoming less visible. The influence in bad and good ways. The communications between Cubans in Miami and Cubans in Cuba are are better than ever before. And I think that there is a good side and there is a bad side to it, but there is a good side. And I think that Cubans that live abroad, which represent 10% of the population at least, we also have an impact. And geographically, we are very close. It's only half an hour away, and that is a factor that needs to be taken into consideration, I think.
So, with this in mind, and considering that the food has arrived, finally, it did. I think we could wrap up and invite you guys for lunch. I think this has been a very enriching discussion. I hope you all have enjoyed it. I think there are several interesting takeaways from here. One that has certainly Chris has illustrated is that while we can be enthusiastic and optimistic of this changing landscape, we have to proceed with caution. We have to be very mindful that we are dealing here not only with an autocratic regime, but one that has proven to be very avid at evolving and very adept at surviving. It survived the collapse of the Soviet Union. It's actually one of the ultimate survivor, we could say, certainly in this hemisphere. We also have to acknowledge that the role of the exile community and the diaspora, the Cuban diaspora, is very, very crucial for the development and the flourishing of this digital media and media period landscape inside the island. The the phenomenons like the paquete, which are vehicles for distribution of foreign content and foreign media content, such as House of Cards and so on. It's also includes TV shows produced by Cubans in Miami. That is also Cuban produced content, in addition to the one that is being now generated inside of the island. The exile community provides the money for people to log on to the Wi-Fi spots. So the exile community remains very, very important, and Cuba becomes more and more a transnational phenomenon. So it is to be seen how this shapes up the development of the digital media landscape. It is a gray space, and Cuban society has becoming more and more with pockets of gray areas, and that makes it more complex, yet more fascinating for us to pay attention and to engage and to try to find ways to open it more and make it more pluralistic and democratic. With that said, thank you for coming and enjoy lunch.